I have the devotion for week 7. I actually got to talk about this text that I want to do the devotion on last week. With week 7, though, we're continuing on with conversational apologetics, and we're going to go back to Acts 8. I talked about the first half of it in the church planter point last week. I'm going to talk about the second half of it here. So, verse 26, I'm going to go through the whole thing. And then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, this is Acts 8, by the way, 26. And an angel of the Lord said to Philip, get up and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is the wilderness road. So he got up and went. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship, and he was returning home, seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, go over to this chariot and join it. So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, do you understand what you're reading? He replied, how can I, unless someone guides me? And he invited Philip to go in and sit beside him. Now the passage of the scripture that he was reading was this: like a sheep who is led to the slaughter, like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life was taken away from the earth. The eunuch asked Philip, about whom, may I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about someone else? Then Philip began to speak, and started with the scripture. He proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. As they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, look, here's water. What is to prevent me from being baptized? He commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more, and went on his way, rejoicing. Something that's really important to me from this text is the unlikely boundary crossing that's happening here. Boundary crossing is an essential part of starting a new church. Many people talk about setting proper boundaries today, which obviously is very important, especially if you're starting a church. Work-life balance and the like, it's important to have proper boundaries. I'm talking about a little different kind of boundary crossing. I'm talking the kind of boundary crossing that places unlikely people together, and the Bible is literally filled with such circumstances, right? I mean, I've heard it said that the Bible is a giant, massive exercise in boundary crossing. I've heard it said that you can open the Bible anywhere you want to open it and point to any scripture, and you can talk about how boundary crossing is happening in that scripture. So when it comes to boundary crossing, I want to think about Acts 8 as a massive exercise in boundary crossing. Now think about that for a second. Think about the boundaries that are crossed between Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, right? I mean, Philip is probably, first of all, very poor. And the Ethiopian eunuch is a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. Now, do you think the eunuch is experiencing poorness? Probably not. Philip does the work here of crossing boundaries with regard to socioeconomic class and status. Now, we're used to the narrative in the church of the rich crossing boundaries to the poor. But I love, in this context, it's the poor crossing boundaries into the rich. So that's boundary number one. Can you think of any others? There are so many, right? Where we could talk about ethnic boundaries that are being crossed here. The Ethiopian eunuch was from Ethiopia. He wasn't probably Middle Eastern. He was probably black. There's an ethnic boundary that's crossed here. Again, the eunuch is from Ethiopia. Therefore, there is a national boundary that's being crossed here. Think of more. We can think about the Ethiopian eunuch. He's a eunuch. There are sexual implications to that. There are sexual boundaries being crossed here. And they can go on and on and on and on and on. You know, it's really tempting to just spend time with people who look like us, who act like us, who are the same ethnicity, who are part of the same socioeconomic class. And I would encourage you, as future church planters, to not submit to this temptation, but to take the extra time and to enjoy the wonder of crossing boundaries with people. When you cross boundaries with people and you participate in reciprocal relationships, I think that you'll experience a huge piece of joy, the kind of joy that at the end of this text here, that the eunuch experienced as he went around and after Philip had left, and as he went around, what did it say? He went on his way, end of verse 39, he went on his way rejoicing. So please, today, tomorrow, this week, what might it look like to have an intentional conversation with someone who's a little bit different than you, and to get used to that as you do this work of starting a new church.